If you played PC games in the 90s, whether as a grizzled veteran of games like Doom and Wolfenstein, or like me, as a clueless kid installing dodgy CDs full of viruses onto the family PC, you might recognise this image. This is the logo for Bullfrog Productions, one of the most renowned video game developers of the 90s, and the creators of games like Theme Hospital, Syndicate, and Theme Park, most of which you've probably heard of, if not played already. Ambitious, experimental, and full of a very self-effacing British personality, Bullfrog's games were kind of a big deal in the 90s, right up there with that one haircut that looked like your nan's curtains. I've been replaying a lot of Bullfrog games lately, and beyond the inherent trauma of trying to run games originally designed for Windows 95, one thing has really stood out to me. These games are all still really entertaining. Even now, 30 years later, Bullfrog's classic simulation games like Theme Hospital and Theme Park still tap into the glee of being bad at business, whether you're overcharging people for Pepsi or misdiagnosing someone with a case of the giggles. Meanwhile, the more experimental output like Syndicate and Magic Carpet still stands out for introducing design concepts far ahead of their time. Jumping from one Bullfrog game to another has made me realise just how varied and innovative all of their games really were. It's an impressive body of work, even if they aren't all necessarily good games in their own right. Bullfrog isn't around anymore. They sold out to Electronic Arts in 1995, long before doing so was cool, and thanks to a bitter cocktail of mismanagement and burnout, they shut their doors just 6 years later in 2001. But the legacy they left behind can't be overlooked. A lot of video games have built on Bullfrog's foundations in the last 20 years, from the Theme Hospital-style chaos of Prison Architect to the in all but name homage of games like Evil Genius and 2 Point Hospital. Going back to their old games, you can really see why their ideas have lasted so long. There's a unique kind of magic to these games, an ambition in their design and their sense of humour that feels as fresh now as it did all those years ago.
No.
But for me, nothing sums up how great Bullfrog's games were like 1999's Dungeon Keeper 2, a fantasy villain simulator that combines a grab bag of aspects from a number of different genres and somehow comes out swinging. In my mind, Dungeon Keeper 2 summarises everything that was great about Bullfrog Productions in one big, messy package. In this video, I'm going to focus on this game, what it got right, what it got less right, and how it reflects on the legacy of Bullfrog Productions after all these years. Sold under the motto, "It's good to be bad," Dungeon Keeper 2 is a campy, Fright Night take on a god game. You play as an all-seeing dungeon master tasked with building a network of grotty dungeons, from which you can emerge, Tremors style, to attack the forces of good and steal their valuables. With a logo like the rock band you formed in Year 8, a cast of characters ripped straight from the darkest depths of DeviantArt, and a sense of humour like Carry On Up the Sticks, Dungeon Keeper 2 is a goofy time capsule of a very specific era in video game design, when nerdy, ambitious passion projects were blessed with big publisher funding and audiences. A beefed up take on 1997's Dungeon Keeper, Dungeon Keeper 2 is as ambitious as it is unhygienic. In each of the game's subterranean levels, you build a dungeon from the ground up and feed, train and babysit its denizens as if it were a god game. Kind of like The Sims, but with a significantly higher quotient of whips and chains. You can't get too comfortable though, because enemies are constantly bearing down on your dungeon, and your ultimate goal is to swarm their base with pixelated, blank-faced goons and destroy it before they can do the same to yours. It's a weird dynamic, forcing the player to switch between the leisurely building and experimentation of a god game and the more traditional sword and sorcery campaigning of a strategy game. Even weirder still, if you click a few buttons on your hotbar, all of that melts away and now you're playing a first-person dungeon crawler within the dungeon you just built. There's a lot going on here. This is a garden shed of game design, so cluttered with ideas that it barely leaves any room to breathe. Your creatures, the extended cast of the Monster Mash, all have their own combat levels and associated abilities, They have happiness bars and hunger and accommodation to manage, and your enemies all have the same. On top of that, the dungeons themselves only become more and more bloated over time, opening up opportunities to torture enemies for information, to summon the dead, to stage fighting competitions, or to encourage new beasties to visit. The user interface is streamlined enough that it doesn't all hit you at once, but there are an overwhelming number of ideas in this game. Not content, like Bullfrog's previous games, to subscribe to just one element of simulation, action, or strategy, Dungeon Keeper instead combines all of these genres into one unstable mix. None are fully fleshed out though, so it's a real-time strategy game where you can't give orders to multiple groups of units. It's a dungeon crawler where every character inexplicably has glaucoma, and at the same time it's also a god game where you govern over a kingdom of non-believers. Dungeon Keeper 2 is almost 3 games in one, but, and this is the surprising bit, it actually works. A lot of games have tried and failed to stitch together multiple genres over the years. The Jack Blackhammer Brütal Legend comes to my mind, but against the odds, Dungeon Keeper is one of the few games that have succeeded. Sold as any of its constituent parts, this would have been a complete disaster, and yet together they just about seem to fit. Bullfrog had a lot of experience building different kinds of games, and I think that this really gave them an insight into the commonalities that different game genres share. Brütal Legend tripped up because it uneasily tried to duct tape together the oil and water of top-down strategy and the hectic button mashing of hack and slash. But Dungeon Keeper 2 succeeds because it unified all of its divergent genres, the god game, the strategy game, and the action game, under the same core set of systems. This game has 3 main resources: mana, cash, and creatures. And regardless of how you approach the game, these resources are always central to your experience. If you approach it as a strategy game, for example, mana creates new units and rallies the troops, gold builds traps and expands your defenses, and creatures are the tools you use to fight and capture new territory. If you approach the game from a god game perspective though, mana is instead the fuel you use for thunderbolts and spells, gold is what you use to buy your creature's favour and build your dream dungeon, and creatures are just the little sims you watch plod around dancing to outdated disco and eating chickens larger than their head. And finally, from a first-person adventure perspective, it's different again. Mana and gold are your rewards for exploring, and creatures are the teammates you lead into uncharted territory, whether you're smacking your face against valiant knights as a goblin, or mining and expanding your land as a lowly imp. However you approach this game, these 3 resources are always central to your experience, and this is the glue that binds Dungeon Keeper's mix of genres together. Dungeon Keeper 2's success is one of perspective. Whether you're zerg rushing the enemy base with squishy goblins or playing Florence Nightingale with your sleeping vampire population, the underlying systems are always the same. It's just a case of how you're looking at them. The game genre at any given moment is largely determined by the camera's frame. If you focus on your base, you're playing a god game. Focus elsewhere, it's a strategy game. Down on the ground, an action game. The pacing is slow enough and the camera is close enough that the player doesn't need to be present in 100 different places at once. You're encouraged to devote yourself to one aspect of the game at a time, and this is rewarded. A claustrophobic level like this, for example, places value on using the game's first-person mode to navigate confusing corridors that the AI would struggle with on its own. Whereas a linear level like this, for example, where you have to kill a target before they can escape, might value a more straightforward strategic approach. Almost like a tower defense game. Dungeon Keeper 2's campaign goes through repeated loops of constricted levels like this that encourage you to explore specific perspectives, followed by larger levels that allow you to frolic and do what you want in a more open setting. This means that by the end of the game's campaign, you feel like you really understand the game's different genre influences and how they intersect with the game's possibilities. The level design may occasionally poke the player in a single direction to encourage them to see what's possible, but the core interplay between the game's resources usually gives the player enough leeway to approach the game how they want. It's this wide array of choices, all tied together by these 3 central resources, that really elevates Dungeon Keeper 2. It may not be as deep as StarCraft, as interesting as The Sims, or even as tense as Dungeon Master, but it's a game of smaller, interconnected ideas that build into a better whole. Dungeon Keeper 2 is a masterful display of how you can jam seemingly conflicting ideas together with Pritstick and make them work. For a game that otherwise seems so bloated, its core mechanics are surprisingly tight. It's consistent in the right place, in its core resource loop, but open everywhere else, allowing the player to latch on to their favourite parts of the game's jumbled genre influences and to ignore the rest. Bullfrog Productions never made a perfect game. At its prime, the studio seemed so blinkered by the broad concept of innovation, jumping from one genre to another if necessary, that it never really settled down and polished one single idea. But Dungeon Keeper 2, as the natural culmination of all the studio's efforts across multiple genres, is probably as close as they ever got. Thanks to its unholy mesh of genres, the blurb for Dungeon Keeper 2 reads like a wish list of Bullfrog's most innovative ideas, and although the monkey's paw may have curled a finger or two along the way, it does deliver. You can see a little bit of all of Bullfrog's previous games in here, from the gleeful chaos of Theme Hospital right through to the janky exploration of Magic Carpet, and in that sense it almost feels like a kind of a swan song for Bullfrog. A final snapshot taken before the studio fell victim to EA's mismanagement. Ultimately, I think Dungeon Keeper 2 exemplifies the best of Bullfrog, insofar as it showcases their willingness to try new things, messy things, bloated things, all tied together with the creative experience and forethought to make them work. Their spirit would be carried on for a while by their successor, the now defunct Lionhead Studios, but luckily it does seem to have spread further since then. These days, the video game industry is a lot bigger, and when I think of Bullfrog's unerring commitment to innovation, I think of modern day studios like Introversion Software and Image and Form Games, studios which are making a wide array of funny, unique games in all sorts of different genres. The torch has been passed on, but it is nice to remember where we came from, and Dungeon Keeper 2, as the summary of a specific era in video game design, is as interesting and entertaining now as it's ever been.